All right, so here's the deal. We're looking at the loanable funds market, which you guys know about. Remember, in the loanable funds market, you've got the supply. That's the lenders, and they're lending out their money. That's just from savings. That's where it comes from. So the savers, they're going to lend. And then you got the demand. And the demand there, that's the borrowers. They're going to borrow so they can purchase investment goods, make investments, increase the capital stock. So you guys have looked at the loanable funds market and looked at the worksheet. So this should be some familiar territory. What we're going to look at here is a phenomenon called crowding out. Because really what we're looking at here is the households are doing the saving. That's on the supply side. And then the demand side, that's the firms borrowing. So you got households, you got firms, but we're going to introduce somebody else big time. And that is the government. See, crowding out is a phenomenon that when the government runs a budget deficit, what is budget deficit? That means that they're spending more than what they're receiving in tax revenues. So that the government runs a budget deficit, how are they going to pay for all that extra spending that they didn't get money from tax revenues for? They're going to have to borrow it. So the government's going to issue bonds. So when the government runs a budget deficit, they're going to increase their borrowing, issue those bonds. Now, what does that mean? They need to head to the loanable funds market. And in the loanable funds market, what's going to happen? Well, the government's borrowing money. That's one way to tell the story. This is the way that you would see, like in the Krugman textbook, an explanation of crowding out. Number one, in crowding out, the government runs a budget deficit, so they've got to increase their borrowing. That's step one in the story of crowding out. Two, they go to the loanable funds market. What's going to happen? They're going to borrow the money. Therefore, demand is going to shift to the right, and that's going to cause real interest rates to go up. Okay, we'll draw that in there. Demand is going to shift to the right, and we said real interest rates will go up. We've seen that before. Demand shifting to the right, causing the price. But in this case, in the market for loanable funds, the price is the real interest rate. So there it is. Boom. That demand curve has shifted to the right, and you see there the real interest rates go up. That's not the complete story yet. Government ran a budget deficit. They increased borrowing. They went to the loanable funds market. That increased the demand for loanable funds. Interest rates went up. Budget deficit, interest rates went up. So what's the impact of that? If interest rates go up, keep in mind that the real interest rate is the cost of borrowing money. The borrowers, they're looking at the situation and saying, hey, high interest rates, we don't want to borrow as much money. It's expensive. Why are we going out high interest rates, borrowing money so we can build a new factory? So what happens is private investment spending decreases. It gets crowded out. That's that phrase, crowding out. So what's crowding out the private business investment? That is the government's borrowing. Because the government's borrowing up money, there's less money available in the loanable funds market for private companies. Now, how we see that on the graph? See, that shift there, if you recall, when we did the shift, we always like to do some arrows showing the magnitude of the shift. So see that arrow there? That arrow showing the magnitude of the shift. How far did the demand curve shift? It's shifted by the amount of the budget deficit, the amount that the government started to borrow. So you get that shift out. But if you guys remember from our analysis of supply and demand, we went through the whole process. We shift, but then we get a movement. As the real interest rate goes up, we're going to have a movement on the curve. That movement on the curve is the response that private businesses are having when the real interest rate starts to go up. We get that movement on the curve. Okay? So sometimes students get confused. They go, well, wait a minute. This shift in demand caused the quantity to go up. The total amount of lending in the market has gone up because the government's borrowing some. And the amount that the government increased its borrowing by is bigger than what private investment cut back by. Okay? That's really important. The shift is bigger than the movement. Take a look at that. The shift is bigger than the movement back. The shift represents how much the government borrowed. The movement is how much private investment spending got crowded out. So you're going to have less private investment spending. That means private businesses aren't going to expand as fast. Now, that could be a problem. Now, depends on what the government's borrowing for. If they're borrowing this money to build infrastructure, to build roads and ports and schools and fire stations, those are investments in our economy. So that actually could be a positive thing. But if they're borrowing for consumption nature items, things that we're going, hey, a big fireworks show, let's shoot off a bunch of fireworks, those things we're not going to use for many years to come. So if they're borrowing for those things, then that's reducing the amount of investment that's occurring overall in our economy. That's going to slow economic growth. Okay, so that's crowding out using the Krugman approach. So his approach was what? Let's recap that. The government is going to borrow more money. Demand shifts to the right. That story makes a lot of sense because the government is borrowing, and borrowing is on the demand side. So that appeals to a lot of people. Now make sure you check out the video on the Mankiw approach, a different way of analyzing it, and the outcome's the same. Even though a lot of people look at the graphs and go, those are different. And then we'll have a video on reconciling that. Okay, so Mankiw approach is next.